Hi, and welcome to another episode of SETI via Facebook Live. Facebook Live presents research here at the SETI Institute. I'm Seth Shostak. You may know that, and if you do, I can only apologize. Here we are at the glamorous SETI Institute in lovely Mountain View, California. And our guest today is Dave Summers. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you.
Dave is actually, he has studied chemistry, but he knows a lot about a lot of different things. So we're going to talk to him today about, well, how did life get started on Earth, but also planetary protection. Now, you may not be, fully conversant what's meant by that, planetary protection. Why do we need to protect the planets? They've been sitting out there for 4.5 billion years, and nobody seems to have attacked them. Dave will tell us why planetary protection is a very interesting discipline. But
well, as I tell my friends, you want your planet protected, don't you?
And what are the answer to that?
Usually yes. Yeah.
Usually yes. All right, Dave has studied chemistry. He is a principal investigator, a senior scientist. Did I get that right? No.
Yep, senior researcher.
Senior researcher here at the SETI Institute. And you've also spent time at other places like NASA Ames Research Center and so forth.
Well, I have a co-op agreement with NASA Ames Research Center, so my office and labs are over there.
Okay. Well, let's go back to the beginning, Dave, and the beginning being, 4 billion years ago when life kind of got started on Earth. I mean, we think somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago, life somehow got cooked up on this planet, but, they didn't leave any notes about how it happened. If somebody asks you, how did life get started, what do you tell them?
Well, I tell them what you'll hear in popular broadcasts is self-replicating molecules, RNA, making copies of itself. There are actually several approaches to it. One is a similar one that has proteins doing the same thing. And the people who believe in the proteins, people who believe in the RNA, argue a lot. And then there's, when I do origin of life, I'm part of what's generally called metabolism first, all the energy things, the chemistry that made your energy starts up first.
Okay, well, let me back up on that a little bit because some of these terms may not be fully familiar to the audience. So some people say, look, life gets started when you get some molecule that can somehow accurately make copies of itself, right?
Well, I guess a way of putting it is RNA world is information came first. RNA is related to DNA, and it's what determines what organisms are like. Everyone's different because they have different DNA. Protein first. Proteins are the things that make things go in your body and form parts of your body. And then metabolism is the thing that takes the food you eat and the air you breathe and uses that to keep you going. Though the part I work on is something called membranes. And it's been shown that, and I could get this more detail if you want, but that you could form something like a cell membrane early on before life existed. And you look at what kind of chemistry could go inside that to lead to the origin of life.
Okay, so am I interpreting this correctly? I mean, people who've looked under a microscope at cells, and that's probably everybody, right? They know that there's an outer wall.
Even they've been forced to at school. Yeah.
Well, exactly, but rightly so. Okay, but they all see that there's cell walls, the membranes, right? And are you suggesting that, well, the membranes came first? I mean, sort of like soap bubbles, right? I can make soap bubbles, and there are all these membranes, but if I look inside those soap bubbles, I don't see any DNA or anything like that that's going to reproduce.
Well, in fact, the analogy is not a bad one. The way soap bubbles hold themselves together and the way that your membranes hold themselves together is similar in many ways. We're assuming cell walls, which are even tougher and we don't have, came later. So, in fact, yes. But they're empty, as you said. And so the research has been, well, maybe they're not so empty and maybe something interesting is going inside of them. And that starts up what they call a protocell, or a first semi-living organism. And that's the general thrust of that research.
Okay, so, well, two things. I mean, how do you make those early membranes? Weren't any people with, soap bubble solution? How do you make, these walls, these little cavities, these little balloons, if you will, that later can develop enough chemistry to produce what we call life?
Well, a scientist called Dave Deamer showed that you can take meteorites, which we know land on Earth all the time, and extract the chemicals out into solution and have these vesicles, they're called, just to be a little more accurate than soap bubbles, form spontaneously in solution.
With the materials from the meteorite.
Right. The meteorite alone can, with the right solvent, to pull them out, and then you put that in water, and they just form on their own.
So it sounds like it's pretty easy to make cell membranes.
Yes, it's among the things that, okay, another part of my research is how you make the stuff that life came out of. Cell membranes are probably the easiest to envision getting made. Now, the lab experiment is not the same as the Atlantic Ocean, but you know, the difference between theory and reality. But in fact, I would argue, and the people who are, some would probably disagree with me, but I would argue that for the life starting from the RNA and the proteins, one of the real problems is Stanley Miller's shock experiments notwithstanding, how you make that stuff is not that clear.
Okay, so the story is something more than 4 billion years, well, more than 3 billion years ago, 4 billion years ago.
More than 3.5.
More than 3.5 billion years ago. It makes this sort of foamy bubble stuff, kind of cell membranes, whatever you're going to call them, right? And then eventually there's some chemistry that gets trapped inside those babies, and now suddenly you have life.
Well, there's a couple steps. It's like
well, I suppose. Otherwise, this would be a settled issue.
It's like South Park, you know, get underwear, question mark, profit.
Yes. I see. Okay, now, where did these first cell membranes spring up? I mean, this is something mildly controversial, is it not? That life began next to a black smoker, you know, a big vent at the bottom of the ocean. Oh no! It began in clay that was on the land, or it began here. It began there. Where do these cell membranes come from?
Well, they come from the meteorites. So the materials you need are all in the meteorites. Meteorites land on the Earth today, and we're pretty sure there were even more of them back 3.5, 4 billion years ago. So that where they come from is they're falling out of the sky.
Does it matter whether they fall in the ocean or they fall on a hunk of
continent? You'd kind of rather they fall like in a small pond, because you'll get a lot more of them in a small area than you will if they land in the ocean. And that issue for everything is an issue that people address in life too. Is if life in the ocean is just the oceans are incredibly big, so everything just gets diluted too much. While if you're talking about ponds or something, then what ponds, how many of them were, you know, you're assuming something. And Occam's razor sort of warns you, well, be worried about assuming things.
But it sounds like Charles Darwin, right? A warm little pond somewhere, the origins of life. I mean, he probably wasn't terribly serious about that, but you're kind of backing him up a little bit, because the ponds
have a certain popularity in this kind of research these days.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Okay. So then it gets started, and eventually, just by accident, or do you need some sort of catalyst of, I don't know, lightning bolts from the sky or something to get the chemistry going inside those membranes?
My research has been how things like mineral particles could get trapped inside, and then light shines on them and they make things inside. And in general, there's a lot of research by people on how having a vesicle like this would make it easier to make the RNA or make it easier to make the DNA. Dave Deamer also showed that you can concentrate things. What happens is your ponds dry out and you form this scum, and then you wet it up again. And you find that all the stuff that was in the ponds has been concentrated more in the vesicle than it was before. And so the next step is trying to figure out how the fact that these vesicles exist, they provide some capability to gain the chemistry you need to start the next step, which is proteins driving other chemistry, or the RNA storing information. Remember that the proteins do stuff and form structure, and the RNA is the information you need to know for an organism to know what it is and how it works. So,
you know, what you describe here, this kind of process, I mean, I can picture it happening on an early Earth, but I could also picture it happening on, all sorts of other planets. I mean, there's nothing particularly Terra-centric about what you're saying.
No.
So, I mean, I assume then that means you think that any planet that's half decent or 2/3 decent or 40% decent, that they will also have a good chance of producing life?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is we know very little about how life might have started on planets outside the solar system. Really, we're kind of pretty sure you need water. And beyond that, it's getting to be guesswork. Mars.
Does it have to be water, by the way? I mean, could you have life on Titan where there's no water, but you got liquid natural gas?
I can't say no. And people have given talks about why you could be something other than water, though I think it's probably water.
You would bet on water.
I would bet on water.
Water.
But it does bring an interesting case. I mean, so Mars, one reason we're interested in life on Mars, or especially past life, is that while the surface isn't very balmy today, back in this 3.5, 4 billion year old period we're talking about, Mars was a lot like the Earth. And this is just sheer speculation, and it's makes it a long shot, but it's interesting. If life started on Mars, you could bring it to Earth, because we know that bits of Mars have landed on Earth. There are meteorites which have been blown off Mars by other meteor impacts and have come to Earth. So if you ask me, could life have started on Mars and been brought here, I couldn't say no. Now, Occam's razor sort of starts cutting in there, so, but.
Yeah, it may be that Mars had its own life, or still does, but not related to us. But the real question was, with other planets.
Well, there's a real chance Mars once had life. There's
Okay.
a really decent chance.
All right. You'd be willing to bet 6 months worth of salary on that, right?
Depends. You give me 2-to-1 odds for sure.
Yeah.
Then my only worry would be, well, when do I get paid off?
Yeah. It's a legitimate worry. So what about, okay, so life on other planets, exoplanets, planets around other stars. I mean, they're going to get rained with meteors too, right?
Yes.
Meteors are not peculiar to our solar system. So, I mean, biology could just be an infection everywhere.
Well, in fact, reason we say after 4 billion years ago is the planet was clearly uninhabitable to at least 4.2, maybe even likely 4 billion years ago. Life just couldn't have started.
Paint a picture for me. What was the Earth
Well,
like?
we made the moon and we melted the crust. And then the question becomes, well, one thing that we argue about is, so you got all these things hitting the planet, and they're just smacking the bejeevers out of it. And the question comes, all right, so a meteor comes in and melts the crust. Well, that life probably couldn't have started before that. A meteor comes in and boils off the oceans. Well, actually, you think life could have started that because there's mud at the bottom of the oceans. So how much do you have to bake that mud to be a sterilizing impact? Yeah. But all that, and it's all interesting, but all that makes a difference between 4.0 and 4.2. Some people say 3.8, but there's kind of a range in there. And then we got solid evidence for life 3.5 billion years ago. So it looks like life started in less than half a billion, about 500 million years, which may seem like a long time, but given our planet's 4.5 billion years old, and the universe is what's numbered these days, 12, 15 billion years
13
old?
and a half.
13 and a half, keeps changing.
It keeps getting older, like all of us.
It kind of appears that life started up pretty much as soon as it could have. And if life started up as soon as it could have on Earth, people think, well, maybe it started up as soon as it could have on other planets. And we don't think Earth's that unique, especially since, at least 1 out of 3, if not more, planets have stars with planets around them. They're like friggin' everywhere.
Yeah. No, the percentage of stars with planets is very high.
Yeah.
The estimated
Been a real
percentage of
game changer.
stars with planets that are sort of the same size as the Earth and maybe in the right position in terms of that's all maybe 1 in 4. So that means there are tens of billions.
I guessed it was like a bit less than 1%, but if it's 1%, that means that anyone can look up, go out to the desert where it's clear, look up in the sky and know that hundreds of stars out there are visible to them that have Earth-like planets.
Okay. Well, you have darker skies than
well, yes, it's.
We do.
I do mean dark sky. Yeah.
These are really, you
but
can see
still,
8th magnitude stars. Okay. Dave, let's shift the topic very slightly. I know you're interested in Mars. You've mentioned the possibility that maybe Mars developed life even before the Earth, and it infected the Earth. And you and I are both Martians. I mean, you may have a castle.
That one's a long shot, but
a long shot. You may have a castle. You may have property on Mars way back that you don't even know about. But let's talk about something else you're interested in, which is planetary protection. Now, what's meant by planetary protection? We're not protecting ourselves against other planets. Are we protecting those planets? Are we protecting what are we protecting?
Well, the answer is yes.
Good. That makes that easy.
I mean, one aspect of planet protection is that, in the movies, after the controversy over life in a meteorite, which I'm going to skip over, there were a lot of TV shows where people would cut in a meteorite and ooze would come out and attack the scientists. Well, that's one thing we're trying to stop. The return sample comes.
That didn't happen in 1996, though.
And black ooze comes out and attacks us all. That's planet protection, right? Stopping that. And in fact, stopping any life from getting back to Earth and return samples is planet protection. But that's only half of it. That's what we call back contamination. We also try to prevent us from doing that to other planets. So when we send spacecraft to Mars, we sterilize them so that they don't spread life on Mars. And in fact, there's a treaty about this. We have to do this. Back in, I think it was the 60s, all the nations sat down and started looking at the exploration that was coming and decided, well, we have to preserve this. And in fact, it's not really done to be kind to Martian microbes. If we send a mission and we contaminate Mars, and then 2 years later another mission finds life on Mars, well, everyone says, well, okay, we just contaminated the planet. It doesn't mean anything. So if we're ever going to find that life started on Mars, we need to do this sort of thing.
But Dave, I mean, there was a spacecraft, I guess it was the Indian spacecraft, the mission to Mars. I don't have this wrong. And it didn't make it. It may have crashed. I don't think it actually did crash, but it's gone. It's gone silent. Whatever's happened, there are mishaps all the time when you throw something at Mars.
Our space program may have crashed one or two.
Oh yes, one or two. More than 50% in the early days. But okay, so this craft, you say, well, it's okay, Bob. It's all sterilized, but it's of course only sterilized to 99.9 something percent. So that means there's still thousands, maybe millions of microbes sitting on this thing.
Well, in fact, people argue about this.
Well,
but
let me hear your take. I mean, have we not already contaminated Mars?
Well, that's the question. I mean, if you could show that we've contaminated Mars beyond if it's just all contaminated, we would give up. But the fact is that the surface of Mars is actually pretty inhospitable. There's nothing on Earth that could live under the conditions on Mars because there's no liquid water. One of NASA's slogans has been follow the water, because almost everywhere we look water, we find life. But
on Earth, anyhow.
On Earth. Well,
yeah.
We're talking about Earth life contaminating Mars, so it applies. The converse is true. If we don't see water, we don't see life. And in fact, the radiation environment on Mars is pretty strong, heavy radiation. So microbes are going to land on Mars, get frozen, and then irradiated, and that's a good way to preserve your food. So it's believed we're still okay. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we send microbes to Mars. They get splattered over a limited amount of real estate, and then get first frozen and then killed by radiation.
Yeah,
that's
the belief.
By the way, I just wanted to point out here, Rebecca has given me a list of places where people are tuned in, and you may recognize some of these places like Norway or Oklahoma, Osage Territory, Australia, Munich, Nederland. Florida. I like Florida. Florida's going to go away in another...
Ontario, Canada. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, right across the border.
Did you have any contact with the Canadians? Was that a life form that infected upper New York State? Oregon, Abergavenny, South Wales.
Oman.
Yes, South Wales. Well, it says near Blaina Festiniog or something. Baton Rouge, Portugal, Texas, Iowa. Okay, here are a couple of questions. Maybe you could, address them.
I think we missed Louisiana too.
Did we miss Louisiana?
Yeah, wouldn't want to miss.
If we missed Louisiana, my apologies.
Yeah.
I mean, we also missed.
We love Louisiana.
Do you? Oh, why? Why is that?
Well, actually, I was just saying it, but New Orleans is a pretty interesting place.
Okay, we'll get back to our travel log discussion here in a moment. I didn't mention Greenland, but of course Greenland is just another one of the states. Okay, so here's a question. Do we know anything about whether there is life on planets outside our solar system? This from Jason.
No, but we're close enough that people started to get excited about it. I mean, before the Kepler mission, we didn't even know where planets were. Kepler mission said, oh, they're all over the darn place. And now, when I go to talks about looking at other planets and gain information about their atmosphere, they're all saying, well, we just need to develop this, or we just need to develop this. It's always the next step in technology, which is a long ways from, well, I don't know if we'll ever be able to do it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And once we know something about an atmosphere, we can start making guesses. Like, for instance, a lot of oxygen is a possibility. Now, people will...
It would be a clue that there's
something. It would be a clue, yeah. And some people would, definitely not going to say would show their life, because I got colleagues who would jump all over me for that. But it would be a clue, and there are other clues you could use to back that up.
What about, just in the news this week, the announcement that the star K218, it was found by the extended Kepler mission, K218, 110 light years from downtown Mountain View, where we're sitting, has a planet in which they have detected in the atmosphere water vapor. Does this get you excited? Does it not get you excited?
It perks my ears up. See, the problem is, what's the temperature? You need liquid water.
Yeah, I think it's in the habitable zone of this dwarf star, so maybe.
And dwarf stars have issues, and if you ask me, do they preclude life? The answer is never no, but it's always maybe.
Well, those issues, I mean, issues.
That's a whole other topic, so that's why I'm sort of just
if you happen to be a red dwarf and you want to hear about your own issues, write Dave.
Yeah, I'll take letters from red dwarf stars.
I think the problem is that they're very active.
I mean, if the models are saying, the surface should be temperate and there's water vapor in the atmosphere, it's like 2 out of 3. And, start thinking, well, maybe you bet on that too, Right. And in fact, it's probably as likely as we're going to get until the next generation of telescopes.
Well, that's the wrong thing to say. What are you saying? Are we going to find any life on other planets, or at least compelling evidence, while you and I are still walking the planet? Or is this, is that a forlorn hope?
I won't ask how old you are.
Well,
I'll say 10 years is
I
pretty
can give you the
iffy.
logarithm.
But after 10 years, 10 years might be a little soon, but that time scale, we're going to start getting a next level of data.
All right, you're about to get a next level question. Do they have the same? This is from Ryan. Do they have the same planetary protection measures when they plan landing missions to asteroids to keep from contaminating our little rocky bunnies?
There are a whole series of classes of objects. When you send a mission to someone, it's classified. If you're sending orbiters around, it's classified and it's odds. Like when you send an orbiter around, we don't actually sterilize our orbiters, which is why when you crash one, everyone runs out and studies the chances that life could survive from them. And you have both the inhabitability of the surface of Mars and things dying when you crash it. But an orbiter, it's not going to touch the surface, and you just show that the odds of it hitting the surface are low enough that it meets the requirements. For landers, if you land on the moon, for example, all you really have to do is write a report of what you landed on the moon.
It is considered so hostile, is it?
Yes, exactly. And in fact, you tell what organics you use, because if someone's looking for, it's not just life, it's also organic material. So if you use like hydrazine, your propellant, you mention that. So if someone lands 10 miles away, finds hydrazine, they don't try to publish. While there are regions on Mars that we probably can't go to right now because the Planetary Protection protocols are too stringent.
All right, let me give you another question. We're getting toward the end of this session here, so if you have questions, don't hold back. Don't, think about this. Don't lie back and think of your question. You'll send it in an hour. That will not help you. Get it in now. Here's one from Richard. Astronomers talk about Goldilocks planets, particularly those people who are interested in soup, all the time, and about the possibility of life on these Goldilocks planets. How can we determine that they are not sterile like Mars? Well, there's an assumption there you may want to contest.
Well, like for instance, the water vapor in your planet around your K dwarf would put it ahead of Mars because it has a lot more water vapor. And Mars, one of Mars's problems is it's dry, too dry. So, already we're finding planets that are better than Mars. We're finding planets where you look at the amount of heat energy they get and how much you think they radiate away, and they're warmer than Mars. And pretty much, when you look at Mars, Venus, and Earth, we can kind of see how pretty much mostly it was the difference between them is size and distance from the sun. Well, we're finding exoplanets of all different sizes and all different distances from the sun, which means some are going to be in the right place. If you just do these statistics, it's not going to be just a few, it's going to be a lot.
What about...
And we're talking about astronomy a lot, like there's a lot of stars in the sky.
Yeah. Well, there are plenty of stars. But what about other places in the solar system that are not, these terrestrial kind of sized planets, but moons around Jupiter and Saturn? You could have life there, right?
Europa's probably the younger child in possibilities of life beyond Earth, because in fact it's got this big ocean on it. Now, earlier I was being asked about whether this kind of life would work on exoplanets. And Europa makes an example of that, because Europa is an ocean world. There is no crust. Could life...
but there's an ice crust.
Well, there's an ice crust, but there's no land on Europa. And if you're thinking, well, life formed in a pond, you need land. But of course, we really don't know. Everything's telling us there are probably ocean worlds out there, worlds that are just one big ocean. Could life start on them? We don't know. First of all, could a few volcanoes poke up? That's always an issue. Do you need land? We don't know. Until we know how life started, which is why we're working on it, we won't really know the answer to that question.
All right. Well, we're coming to the end here. I'm going to ask you one final question, Dave. You've been doing this for a while. I've known you for a while. And, these
you still talk to me.
And I still talk to you. And these are very complicated issues. I've been over to your lab, and, it looked like, I don't know, the bowels of the Starship Enterprise. Not that I've ever been there, but, the piping and tubing and all this glassware everywhere, right? So you're doing very complex stuff.
Well, one problem with Enterprise is their labs are always spotless and only had a few pieces of equipment.
Yeah, they could manage that, but they could never silence the doors. So if somebody says, okay, Dave, you've been working on this your entire career, are we going to get to the answer of either there's life in space, are we going to be able to answer that, or at least how life got started on Earth, which would give us some insight into that first question?
Well, we will determine whether there's life on other planets. It's just, they're there. There are too many of them for that life to be non-existent because the planets don't exist. And at some point, technology, like the chips going twice as fast every 10 years and all that stuff, eventually we're going to determine that sooner or later.
So you're not discouraged, but are you personally discouraged?
Will we find life on other planets in my lifetime, for example?
For example.
Well, given I'm only 20, though, I'm hopeful, even if I'm not just 20. And I'm also think we're going to find a good chance of finding how life might have started. We're making progress towards how life could start, but one interesting thing is if we figure out life starts in a test tube, is that the way? Is there only one way for life to start? And since we know so little about the early Earth, but as we start looking at these other planets, we're not going to just be guessing what the early Earth likes. We're going to see planets that are in the state that Earth was when life started, and we're going to start knowing the question of that. So I would say it's all inevitable. It's a lot of it's likely in our lifetimes, and even more so younger viewers out there, ones under 20, and beyond that, it will happen sometime.
All right. It's a golden age in a way.
Oh, our knowledge of the Kepler mission alone just changed everything.
All right. Well, Dave Summers, thank you very much for speaking with us. You know, this really interesting stuff, I got to say. I always wondered what you were doing over there, and I have a better idea. And I will be careful, not to, maybe I'll roast up a couple of bubbles tonight for dinner, something like that. Thanks very much for tuning in to SETI Live here from the SETI Institute, and we'll see you next time.